Imagine finding out that your wife didn't marry you for love, but for everything you own. When her perfect plan unraveled, her true intentions came to light in ways I never saw coming. My name's Mark, and I'm 42. Until recently, I was married to a woman I thought I knew, Julia. She's 10 years younger than me, which was never an issue for us, or so I thought. I met Julia 3 years ago at a friend's party. She was charming, beautiful, the kind of woman who could light up any room she walked into. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only one in the room. We hit it off, and within a year, we were married. At the time, I felt like I'd hit the jackpot. Life seemed good. She moved into my house, a place I'd inherited from my late father, and we settled into what felt like a solid routine. She'd constantly compliment me on how stable and secure our life was, especially compared to what she said was her rough past of constantly moving from one rented place to another. It felt good, hearing that. Like I was finally able to offer someone a safe haven. But then, little things started to seem off. Julia started getting distant, almost as if she was holding back. She'd disappear for long work trips, though she didn't exactly have the kind of job that required traveling. She'd spend long hours out with friends, but when I'd ask to join her or meet these friends, she'd brush it off, saying it was a girls' night thing or that she didn't want me to feel left out. Then there was the way she always seemed interested in our finances. I'd catch her going through bills, asking about insurance policies, and inquiring about all the assets I owned. I figured she was just being curious and wanting to be part of the financial decisions, but there was something about the way she'd probe into details, especially about the house. It was subtle, but her questions seemed a bit too pointed. At the time, I brushed it off, thinking she just wanted to be involved. I loved her, after all, and if she was interested in our future, that was only a good thing, right? But that was before I stumbled upon the first clue that shattered my image of Julia. Looking back, I realize I was blinded by my feelings. But as the months passed, the signs became harder to ignore. I had no idea just how deep her deception went, or how close I was to uncovering the real Julia, the one hidden behind a perfect facade. One evening, over dinner, I brought up something I'd been thinking about for a while, starting a family. To me, it felt like the next natural step, something I'd always envisioned as part of my life. Julia, however, didn't seem as thrilled. In fact, her reaction was so strong that it threw me off completely. "Children? What children?" she said, her face twisting as if I'd suggested something outrageous. I tried to keep it light. "Well, you know, kids. A family. We've been married for a while now, and I thought it was time we started thinking about it." She put down her fork and looked at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language. "Mark, I'm not ready for kids. I'm still young, I want to enjoy life a little longer. Travel, do things. I haven't had enough fun yet." I felt a wave of disappointment mixed with confusion. "Julia, we're married. Building a life together is part of that, and for me, that includes children. If you're not interested in that, then maybe we need to rethink things." The words came out before I'd fully thought them through, and I could see her face instantly change. She looked afraid, almost panicked, her usual confidence replaced by a vulnerability I'd never seen in her before. "No, Mark, there's no need for that. I just wasn't expecting the conversation yet. Maybe, in a couple of years." She gave a small, uneasy smile, as if that would ease things over. "A couple of years?" I repeated, leaning forward. "Julia, I've had my share of fun. I want a family. I want stability. I'm not waiting around forever. You have to decide, either we're serious about building a family together, or we go our separate ways." She hesitated, glancing away. "Okay," she said finally, her voice softer, a hint of resentment there. "We can think about children. I'm just not used to the idea yet." In that moment, something didn't sit right. Her reaction didn't feel like hesitation or nervousness, it felt like reluctance, almost like she was agreeing just to avoid an argument. But I told myself I was overthinking things. Julia had agreed, hadn't she? I figured she just needed some time to adjust. Little did I know that night's conversation had barely scratched the surface of what was really going on. A few nights after our conversation about starting a family, I overheard Julia on the phone in the other room. Her voice was low, and at first, I didn't think much of it. She made calls all the time. But as I walked closer, I caught a fragment of what she was saying, and it stopped me in my tracks. Can you believe it? He actually wants children. What am I supposed to do about this? I felt a jolt of anger and confusion. Julia's tone was one of irritation, even frustration, not excitement. It was clear she wasn't sharing happy news, she was complaining, as if I'd asked for something absurd. I stayed still for a moment, waiting to hear more, but as soon as she caught sight of me in the doorway, she hung up abruptly, her eyes widening. Who were you talking to? I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as I could, though my gut was twisted with suspicion. Oh, it was, just my mom, she said, giving me a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I was telling her about us, you know, about wanting kids. But I couldn't shake what I just overheard. The words she'd chosen, the irritation in her voice, none of it matched up with her explanation. She wasn't sharing news with her mother, she'd been venting, like it was a burden to even think about having a family with me. I kept my expression blank and nodded slowly, though inside, doubt started to spread. Something was off, and as much as I wanted to ignore it, that moment stayed with me. I knew what I'd heard, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Julia wasn't telling me the whole story. But for now, I kept quiet, waiting to see if more would unfold on its own. Months went by, and despite our efforts, nothing happened. I was more than ready to become a father, and the repeated disappointments started to weigh on me. But I didn't want to leave anything to chance, so I paid for top doctors, tests, treatments, whatever might help us. The doctors ran every test available, and when the results came back, they told me that I was in perfect health. Julia's tests also showed no apparent issues. As far as science was concerned, there was no reason why we shouldn't be able to have a child. One day, I stopped by the clinic to pick up some paperwork and to see if there was anything else the doctors could recommend. The doctor handling our case, a new specialist I hadn't yet met, called me into his office. He started to go over my results, but then, with a look of hesitation, added, "I also have some news about your wife's results." I wasn't sure whether to mention this, but it might shed some light on your situation. I raised an eyebrow, surprised. News? What kind of news? Well, he began cautiously, when we performed a deeper analysis of Julia's blood work, we found traces of birth control hormones. It's subtle, but clearly visible, she had been on birth control recently. It appears that she may have stopped taking them just before the blood draw, but the traces lingered. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. All this time, Julia had been secretly taking birth control. She had let me spend thousands on tests, consultations, and treatments, all while making sure we couldn't conceive. When I got home, I was already simmering with anger, the whole situation still fresh in my mind. Julia was in the living room, reading, and she looked up with a smile when I walked in, but I could barely hold back. "Julia, we need to talk," I said, my voice strained. She sensed my tone and looked concerned. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" I repeated, feeling the anger rise. "What's wrong is that I just spent months and thousands of dollars on tests and treatments, only to find out you've been secretly taking birth control pills. The doctors found traces of it in your blood. Do you have any idea how much I've invested in this? How many nights I spent wondering what was wrong?" Julia's face paled, and her confident demeanor shattered. "Mark, I'm sorry. I was just shocked. I wasn't ready, and everything was happening so fast. I didn't mean to deceive you, I was just scared and needed time." She started to cry, apologizing profusely, saying that she'd stopped taking the pills now and was ready to try for real. She promised that she was ready this time, that she truly wanted to start a family. I took a long breath, watching her carefully. Part of me was still furious, but there was another part that softened as I saw her regret. Maybe she really had been overwhelmed, and maybe I had pressured her too soon. I shook my head slowly. Julia, this is the last time I'm letting this slide. If you're not serious about this, or if I find out you're hiding anything else, I'm done. She nodded quickly, wiping her tears. I understand. I swear, no more pills, no more lies. I'm ready, Mark. Despite everything, I let myself believe her. I wanted this to work, I wanted a family. But as I turned away, I couldn't quite shake the lingering doubt in the back of my mind. Something still didn't feel right, and I had the unsettling sense that this wasn't the last secret Julia was hiding from me. A month slipped by since our last argument, and just as things began to settle, Julia came to me on a Friday night with a smile that could light up the whole room. I had barely finished unwinding from work when she appeared, hands behind her back, eyes dancing with excitement. She was practically glowing, and I knew something was up. Congratulations, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it was packed with energy. We're pregnant. I felt my heart stop, like I'd been caught off guard by the best surprise in the world. She grinned wider, then slowly brought out a pregnancy test and set of ultrasound pictures, placing them in my hands with a flourish. I looked down, and there on the screen were two tiny, unmistakable forms. Twins, she said, her voice full of wonder. We're having twins. For a second, I thought my legs might give out. My mind raced, my heart pounding as I tried to wrap my head around it all. Twins. Not just one, but two little lives about to join our world. This was more than I could have hoped for, more than I even dared to imagine after everything we'd been through. I looked up at her, stunned, but she was just beaming, waiting for my reaction. Oh, she said with a smirk, trying to play it off casually, I hope at least one of them will be a helper around the house. She laughed, giving me a playful nudge. I pulled her into my arms, my head spinning with excitement and dreams of the future. Of course they will. We'll have two little helpers, and I'll make sure they have everything they need. They're going to have the best of everything, I said, the words spilling out with more joy than I'd felt in a long time. Julia leaned her head on my shoulder, and we stood there, caught up in the excitement, talking about nursery themes, baby names, even what the first few months would look like. Her energy was contagious, and for the first time in ages, I could feel myself letting go of the lingering doubts. Right then, everything felt perfect, like we were on the brink of something extraordinary. Still, somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered, warning me to be careful, to stay alert. But I chose to ignore it. After all, I'd been waiting for this moment for so long. And as I held her, imagining the life we'd build together with our future children, I decided to push aside those nagging thoughts and believe in this new beginning. This was our family, our chance at happiness. And right then, I wanted nothing more than to embrace it fully. After the news of our twins settled in, I wanted to make sure that Julia had everything she could possibly need for the pregnancy. The very next day, I arranged for her to be transferred to the best clinic in town, a place with a reputation for exceptional care and a full team of specialists. I wanted every detail covered, no compromises. Once that was set, we threw ourselves into preparations. We started shopping for strollers, baby clothes, tiny blankets, and everything in between. I felt a kind of excitement I hadn't felt in years, each little onesie and baby shoe made it feel more real. Julia and I spent hours poring over every detail, picking out the best for the babies that were on the way. A few weeks into this whirlwind, I decided to surprise her. I booked her a ticket to a luxury resort in a warm, coastal spot, a place she had always dreamed of visiting. I thought she could use the break and a little time for herself before life turned upside down with twins. When I gave her the ticket, her eyes sparkled with surprise and gratitude. "Mark, this is incredible. Are you sure?" "Absolutely," I said with a smile. "You deserve it, and you'll come back feeling refreshed. Plus, it's just a week, and I'll be here getting everything ready for when you get back." She hugged me, clearly touched, and I could see that I'd made her truly happy. As she packed her things and prepared to leave, I stayed back, working around the clock to make sure the house was in perfect shape for her and our future family. Work was relentless, but every time I felt worn out, I reminded myself of what lay ahead. Each long day was an investment in a future I couldn't wait to begin. Seeing Julia happy, preparing for our twins, and imagining the family life we'd soon have kept me going. For now, I chose to focus on that future and to put every bit of effort into making it as perfect as possible. After Julia left for her week in the sun, I threw myself into work and final preparations for the twins. The days passed by in a blur of meetings, late nights, and running errands to make sure everything was just right for when she returned. The house felt oddly quiet without her, but I tried to ignore the feeling, focusing instead on my long to-do list. One evening, I decided to tackle some cleaning in the living room. I wanted the house spotless by the time she returned, hoping it would be a nice gesture to welcome her back. As I was tidying up a cabinet, my hand brushed against something unfamiliar behind a stack of books. I pulled it out, surprised to find an old phone, one I didn't recognize at all. It was an outdated model, not one I'd ever seen Julia with. My first thought was that it had to be an old phone she'd forgotten about, but then I realized. Julia had never mentioned having a second phone. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. She always used the latest model, and this one looked cheap, old, almost like something someone would use to keep their activities hidden. I turned the phone over in my hands, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and unease. Something inside me told me to leave it alone, to ignore it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, so I pressed the power button, waiting as the screen flickered on. The phone was unlocked, and as the home screen lit up, I noticed it had barely any apps, just the basics. Hesitantly, I opened the Messages app. I told myself I'd just take a quick look and put it away. But the moment I opened the messages, I felt my pulse quicken. There was a string of recent texts with a contact simply labeled with a single emoji, a heart. The first message I read made me freeze. Everything worked out. We're going to have twins soon, just like we planned. I blinked, feeling my heart hammering in my chest as I stared at the words. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Twins. Planned. This sounded almost calculated. I scrolled up further, feeling dread pool in my stomach with each new message. I can't believe it's finally happening, another message read. He has no idea. Once everything's set, we'll have what we wanted. As I continued reading, the reality of the situation became clearer. Whoever Julia was talking to was a part of her life I knew nothing about, someone she was confiding in about the twins, not with the joy or excitement of a wife sharing with her husband, but with the clinical, almost detached language of someone executing a plan. There were more messages, each one hitting harder than the last. There were talks of timing, of steps to be taken, and a disturbingly casual mention of waiting until the right moment. Everything pointed to one thing: Julia was orchestrating something, and I was at the center of it. My mind reeled, and 1,000 questions flooded my thoughts. Who was this person she was talking to? How long had this been going on? Were the twins, my twins, part of some twisted scheme? The very idea of it made me feel sick. I put the phone down for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. After a few minutes, I picked up the phone again, this time scrolling to the very beginning of the conversation thread, hoping to find some context, some piece of information that would make this all make sense. Instead, I found only more evidence that I was being played. In one of the earliest messages, the mysterious contact had asked her, "So when are you finally leaving him?" Julia's response was immediate, confident: "Soon. Once everything's in place, I'll have what I need. I felt a numbness settle over me. My mind raced through the last few years, looking for clues, signs, anything that would have pointed to this betrayal. But she'd been careful, almost unbelievably so. Her charm, her warmth, the way she'd settled into our life, all of it had been an act. As I sat there, staring at the screen, I realized that I hadn't just uncovered a secret phone, I'd uncovered a secret life, one Julia had hidden from me with expert precision. And now, here I was, holding the proof of her deception in my hands. But instead of answers, all I had were more questions. After finding that phone and reading those messages, I knew I couldn't rely on just what I'd seen. Julia had gone to great lengths to keep this hidden, which meant there was likely a lot more buried under the surface. I decided to reach out to someone who specialized in finding the truth, someone who knew how to dig deeper, quietly and thoroughly. 2 days later, I got a call. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, where he handed me a manila folder. His expression was serious, almost apologetic, as he explained what he'd found. "Your wife's been seeing someone regularly," he said quietly, his tone professional but cautious. "Dates back a few years, actually. She's careful, meetings in out-of-the-way spots, using aliases, the whole 9 yards." My pulse quickened as I flipped through the documents, each page revealing another layer of deception. Photos of Julia with this mystery man, time-stamped evidence of secret meetings, reservations, and even a few receipts for lavish gifts she'd paid for with money I hadn't even realized was missing. My stomach twisted as I realized how far her betrayal went. And there, in black and white, was the final blow, a series of text messages and emails detailing her plan. "She's been planning to divorce you," he continued, keeping his voice low. "But only after she's ensured she'd get a significant share of your assets. According to these messages, she thinks she's entitled to everything you've built." I glanced at him, a wry smile forming as a sense of dark satisfaction settled over me. She was in for a rude awakening. Julia thought she'd played this perfectly, thought she'd secured herself a future with everything I'd worked for. But she had no idea that all of my assets, every last property, investment, even the house we lived in, were in my mother's name, not mine. She'd been building her house of cards on a foundation that didn't even belong to her. "Thank you," I said, standing and shaking his hand, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fury simmering beneath. "You've given me exactly what I needed." With that, I left and immediately called my lawyer. When he picked up, I didn't waste time. "Prepare the divorce papers," I said, my tone icy and resolute. "And make sure it's airtight. My wife's about to learn the consequences of her little game." As I hung up, a strange calm washed over me. The shock, the hurt, even the betrayal had settled into something sharper, a resolve to end this charade on my terms. Julia might think she's won, but she has no idea what's coming. The week passed quietly, and I kept myself busy, waiting for Julia to return from her luxurious getaway. I'd set everything in motion with the lawyer, papers drawn and the court date arranged. All that was left was to watch the plan unfold. When she came through the front door, she looked radiant, her skin sun-kissed from her time away, a wide smile on her face. She held the mail she'd picked up on the way in, and as she closed the door, she leaned in and gave me a quick kiss, completely oblivious to the storm she was about to step into. She waltzed into the kitchen, dropping her bag on the counter and setting the stack of mail down beside it. I stayed in the doorway, watching as she flipped through bills, magazines, and finally came across a crisp white envelope, stamped with the official seal. She paused, frowning, and glanced back at me, surprise in her eyes. "Mark, what's this?" she asked, holding up the letter. I stepped forward, keeping my face unreadable. "That," I said calmly, "is an invitation to court. For our divorce." She blinked, as if trying to process my words. Her eyes went wide, her smile faltering. "Wait, what? Divorce? I don't understand." "We're fine, I'm pregnant, we're starting a family." I felt a wave of frustration rise but kept my composure, each word deliberate. Julia, I'm done with the games, with the lies, with all of it. You'll understand everything soon enough. I'm tired of being kept in the dark. Her face paled as she registered the seriousness in my voice, her shock transforming to panic. She set the letter down with shaking hands, grabbed her bag, and without another word, turned and headed for the door, barely able to look at me. I didn't ask where she was going. I didn't care. This was the end of her charade. She thought she had me cornered, that her plan was foolproof. But she was about to discover that her own scheme had been built on a foundation of lies, and that I wasn't as blind as she'd thought. As she disappeared through the door, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The truth was finally coming to light, and this time, I was in control. The day of the trial arrived, and I was more than ready. I had everything lined up, all the evidence, every hidden detail Julia didn't know I'd uncovered. As I walked into the courthouse, I saw her standing by the entrance, arms crossed, her face a mask of anger and confidence. Just before I reached the doors, she snapped, her voice low but sharp. I'm going to take everything from you, Mark. You'll see. The court will be on my side. Her words were icy, dripping with the same entitlement she'd hidden so well during our marriage. But I stayed calm, almost amused. I'd already seen the depths of her lies, and this was just one more bluff. My lawyer, walking beside me, heard her as well and leaned in with a smirk. Careful, Mark, he whispered, chuckling. That's nothing but a provocation. The most she'll be walking away with is a single account that holds about $200. We shared a quiet laugh, Julia's words now nothing more than background noise. Together, we entered the courtroom, ready for whatever tactics she and her lawyer might throw our way. Julia might have thought she was untouchable, but today she was about to learn the truth. The life she thought she'd built was built on nothing at all. The trial began, and Julia's lawyer took the floor, starting with a speech that was all too familiar, painted with lies and manipulation, crafted to make her seem like the devoted wife and future mother she'd always pretended to be. He spoke with the kind of practiced charm that made every word seem authentic, but I knew better. I just hadn't expected the twist he was about to throw at us. Your Honor, he began, glancing at Julia, who looked composed, almost smug. My client, Mrs. Julia Miller, has been a supportive, devoted wife. She and her husband were eagerly anticipating the arrival of twins, and despite these sudden divorce proceedings, she is willing to undergo a DNA test to prove that these children are indeed his. I felt my heart skip a beat, my mind racing. Why was she so confident about the DNA test? What game was she playing here? I glanced at Julia, who was watching me with an expression that looked eerily like satisfaction, as though she had an ace up her sleeve. For a moment, doubts crept in. Was there a possibility the twins were actually mine? My lawyer leaned in, sensing my hesitation. Remember, this is just another tactic. Stay calm, he whispered, his tone firm. If they are your children, this could work in your favor. And if they aren't, then we'll have all the proof we need to show her deception. I nodded, grounding myself in his assurance. Julia's confidence only made the truth more urgent. I had to know, once and for all, where I stood in this twisted mess. So, after her lawyer's performance, we agreed to move forward with the DNA test. It was the only way to settle it, to cut through the uncertainty. We left the courtroom that day with a date set for the second hearing and the DNA test scheduled. I could see Julia stealing glances at me, her expression unreadable, as if she knew something I didn't. But I was done being pulled along by her games. Whatever the results, I would face them head-on. And I knew that, for the first time in this entire ordeal, the truth would finally be on my side. The second hearing finally arrived, and there was a quiet tension as we all took our seats. Julia sat confidently beside her lawyer, glancing my way with a smug look that almost dared me to react. She believed she was about to get everything, my assets, my future, and even what she had been pretending were our children. But today, I knew the truth would finally come out. The judge held a white envelope in his hands, the DNA test results. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as he carefully opened it, his expression serious as he scanned the paper inside. He looked up, his gaze resting on Julia with an almost disappointed calm. "The DNA test results confirm," he said slowly, "that Mr. Miller is not the biological father of the children in question." The words echoed in the room, hitting like a punch. I glanced at Julia, and for the first time, her face faltered. The smugness disappeared, replaced by a flash of surprise and panic she couldn't hide. Her lawyer looked equally shaken, shifting in his seat, his carefully crafted composure beginning to crack. My lawyer rose from his seat, the calm confidence in his tone a stark contrast to the chaos unraveling across the aisle. "Your Honor, we'd like to present evidence that this case was not conducted in good faith by Mrs. Miller or her counsel. Here," he said, holding up a folder, "is proof of a plot to falsify the DNA test results to suggest that these children were Mr. Miller's. We have records of conversations and correspondence between Mrs. Miller's counsel and a third party, detailing attempts to tamper with the results." The judge took the documents, his expression darkening as he read. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the revelation settling in. Julia's lawyer tried to stammer out a defense, but the evidence was there, laid bare. Her entire case was unraveling right before her eyes. My lawyer continued, "And one more thing, Your Honor. Before passing a final judgment, we'd like to address the division of assets. Mrs. Miller has argued that she's entitled to half of everything my client owns, including properties, accounts, shares, and vehicles. However, we've provided full documentation here showing that all major assets, every property, share, and vehicle, are registered not under Mr. Miller's name, but under his mother's. Legally, Mrs. Miller has no claim to these assets in the event of a divorce." The judge leafed through the documents my lawyer presented, taking in every detail. Julia sat motionless, her face pale as the reality of her situation sank in. Everything she had been counting on, every detail she had planned so carefully, was slipping away, revealed to be nothing more than a fragile lie. The judge finally looked up, his voice clear and final. "Given the evidence of fraud, the results of the DNA test, and the clear documentation regarding ownership of assets, it's clear that Mrs. Miller has attempted to deceive this court and her spouse. Therefore, in addition to the denial of her claims to Mr. Miller's assets, Mrs. Miller will also be liable for legal fees incurred by her misconduct and will not receive any further financial support." Julia's face fell, her bravado shattered. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. I didn't wait for her to recover. I knew I was finally free from her deception, and she was left to face the consequences of her own actions, alone. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, signaling the end of the trial. My divorce was officially approved, and with it came the complete unraveling of Julia's elaborate scheme. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a freedom I hadn't felt in what seemed like ages. The lies, the games, the betrayal, all of it was finally over. As we stepped out of the courtroom, my lawyer turned to me, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well," he said with a satisfied chuckle, "not only did she fail to take everything, but she didn't even get the $200 from your joint account." We both laughed, the sound of our relief filling the hallway. I had walked in with everything she tried to steal still intact, and she had left with nothing but the reality of her own deception. As we walked past the courthouse doors, I glanced back and saw Julia emerging behind us. Gone was her confident facade, in its place was a woman who looked utterly defeated, her face a mix of anger and despair. This was her reality now, a plan that had turned to ash, a future she'd built on lies, now crumbling beneath her. She shot me one last look, a glare full of resentment, but I simply turned and walked away, feeling nothing but a sense of justice finally served. I had survived her betrayal and come out stronger, with everything I valued still in place. The chapter was closed, the deception laid bare, and as I walked away, I knew I could finally move forward. Free from her shadows, ready to live my life on my own terms. In the weeks that followed the trial, a sense of relief settled over me that was difficult to put into words. For the first time in years, I felt truly free, as though a heavy burden had finally lifted. The layers of deception and betrayal that Julia had woven around my life had been peeled back, leaving me with a clarity I hadn't known in a long time. The stress, the doubts, the constant suspicion, it was all gone. I could finally look forward and focus on my own life, without the shadow of her lies looming over me. But just as I was starting to reclaim that peace, I began to hear rumors about Julia's life after the trial. At first, I dismissed them as idle gossip. After all, I had no interest in her life anymore, no desire to revisit that chapter. But the details of her situation slowly trickled in from friends and acquaintances, and what I heard shocked me more than I ever could have imagined. Apparently, Julia had tried to return to the man she'd been seeing behind my back, the one she'd been conspiring with throughout our marriage. This was the man she'd counted on to build her future with once she'd taken everything from me. She must have thought that, even without my assets, he would still be waiting for her, willing to start a new life. But it hadn't turned out that way at all. It turned out that this man, the one she'd thrown everything away for, had only been interested in her because he believed she was bringing a small fortune with her. He'd been more than happy to play along when she was dangling my assets in front of him, convincing him they'd have a life of luxury and ease once she pulled off her scheme. But now, with nothing in her name, with no claim to my assets, she was no longer the attractive prospect she had once been. From what I gathered, the reunion had gone sour almost immediately. He had welcomed her back initially, likely expecting some remnant of my finances would still come her way. But as reality set in, and as he realized she'd come back empty-handed, he'd turned cold. Without the financial support she'd promised, without the lifestyle she'd painted in such grandiose terms, their relationship unraveled just as quickly as our marriage had. It was rumored that he'd even kicked her out, leaving her stranded and desperate, with nowhere to turn. The man she'd conspired with, the one she'd pinned her hopes on, had no interest in a future without money, and with no resources of his own, he saw no reason to stay with her. He'd relied on her manipulations as much as she had, and without my assets, they were just two people facing a hard, empty reality. But the most shocking detail, the one that left me truly speechless, was learning that Julia had ended the pregnancy. She had chosen to let go of the very children she had used as leverage against me. The twins, whom she had paraded as my future, as part of our family to be, were suddenly deemed disposable the moment they no longer served her plan. When I heard that, I felt a mix of disbelief, sorrow, and a profound sense of closure. It wasn't so much anger anymore, I think I was beyond that. But the shock lingered, like the last piece of a twisted puzzle falling into place. Julia's decision made me realize the true depths of her character, or lack thereof. She had been willing to discard the lives of her unborn children as easily as she had discarded her marriage, her trust, and any semblance of genuine connection. And that's when it hit me, I had never really known the person I had married. I'd shared my life, my hopes, and my dreams with someone who saw all of it as a stepping stone to her own selfish ambitions. The woman I thought I loved, the woman I'd imagined a future with, had been nothing more than a mask. Beneath it was someone cold, calculated, willing to exploit anyone, including her own children, to get what she wanted. As I processed everything, I realized just how fortunate I was to have escaped her clutches before she could destroy more than just my trust. I felt relief, but I also felt grateful. Grateful that, despite her deception, I still had the foundation of my own life intact, and the chance to rebuild from a place of honesty and strength. She'd lost everything by pursuing a life built on lies, while I'd gained clarity and freedom in finally seeing the truth. And so, with each passing day, I let go of the memories and the hurt she had caused. I embraced the chance to live genuinely, to reclaim my life without the shadow of her schemes darkening my path. Julia was now nothing more than a distant lesson, a reminder of what can happen when trust is taken for granted. Moving forward, I could finally do so with peace. I had freed myself not only from a toxic relationship but also from a life of illusion. I could live without looking over my shoulder, without second-guessing every moment, because I knew now that my life was truly my own.